altars, two beliefs, an entirely divided people, and only one question echoing at the top of the mountain: who is the true God? On that day, there would be no room for diplomatic speeches. There would be no theological arguments. Only one answer. We travel back in time to the year 850 BC. Israel was living through one of the most confusing and dangerous moments in its entire history. If you analyze the context of the time, the problem there was not an absence of faith. The nation had not become atheist. The problem was something much more subtle and lethal: the mixture. Society had adopted a spiritual convenience, a little of the God of their ancestors to maintain tradition, and a little of Baal and other foreign beliefs to try and guarantee successful harvests and the economy. Everything seemed to work perfectly on the surface. It was a very comfortable mixture, sponsored by the state itself, under the rule of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. But this absolute tolerance created a collapse in the people's identity, to the point where the doubt about who really ruled the world became unsustainable. And it is exactly in this scenario of national paralysis that a man emerges. He doesn't come out of the political corridors. He does not come with diplomacy. He does not seek agreements, and he doesn't want conciliation. He brings a direct challenge. Elijah climbs Mount Carmel, and what he proposes breaks all the logic of the time, an ultimatum that leaves no room for middle ground. To understand the magnitude of the event on Mount Carmel, we must first dismantle a historical illusion. When we think of Israel in the year 850 BC, the tendency is to imagine a nation that simply turned its back on the God of the Exodus and embraced paganism absolutely. But the investigative reality shows us a much more complex and lethal scenario. The crisis was not an external rupture. It wasn't a military invasion forcing a culture change. It was an internal fracture, a silent collapse of identity. The people had not completely abandoned the faith of their ancestors. If you walked the streets of Samaria at that time, you would still find families practicing ancient rituals, parents teaching their children the stories of crossing the Red Sea and the liberation from Egypt. The central problem was that they did not remain exclusively in that faith. Society adopted a pragmatic survival system, syncretism. In the mind of the common citizen of that time, logic operated as a kind of double insurance. The God of Moses was revered for national history, but when it came to basic economics, ensuring rain for the harvest and the fertility of the land, the cultural propaganda of the time claimed that Baal was the great expert. Baal was worshipped throughout the region of Canaan as the Lord of the weather. And when King Ahab married the foreign princess Jezebel, this worship ceased to be a marginal practice. It became institutionalized and funded by the state machine. Hundreds of pagan priests began to be supported by public money, while the original prophets were systematically silenced or eliminated from public life. Faced with this enormous political and social pressure, the people simply adapted. It was a comfortable mixture. You didn't have to be a radical. A person could go to the altar of one in the morning and pay reverence at the altar of the other in the afternoon. There was no declared conflict. There was no demand for exclusivity. Israeli society began to limp between two paths to avoid friction. And this creates a devastating sociological and spiritual problem. When everything seems acceptable, nothing is really true. If two statements that are completely opposite are treated as equally valid by the state and the population, the truth loses all its functional weight. The people entered a state of dormancy. They were anesthetized by this absolute tolerance where no one wanted to pick a moral or ideological fight. After all, if the system was standing, why question who ruled it? But the truth has its own intolerant mechanics. It cannot bear division for long. To sustain this structural lie, Israel had to ignore that the basis of its foundation required absolute exclusivity. It is exactly in this scenario of mental lethargy and paralysis that the figure of Elijah takes on gigantic proportions. His very name was already a direct affront to the system, as Elijah literally means, "The Lord is my God." He was a living offense walking the streets of a mixed kingdom. Elijah doesn't arrive to present a new bill or attempt a diplomatic agreement with King Ahab. He makes a cold reading of the situation, understands that the nation is sick, and that a mild remedy would have no effect. The mental anesthesia of the people needed to be cut off abruptly. He looks at a crowd that had grown accustomed to not making difficult decisions and exposes everyone's failure. The question he asks is not a polite invitation. It is a direct blow to the structure of society. How long will you waver between two opinions? He exposes the hypocrisy of trying to balance incompatible realities. Elijah knew that the only way to heal that nation would be by forcing them to look at the raw reality without filters and without political excuses. And for this, theory would no longer suffice. An irrefutable proof was needed. Before we discover what brilliant strategy and unlikely challenge Elijah placed before this crowd, I need to make a quick request. If you like understanding the scriptures in this investigative way, diving into the real history and details few talk about, leave your like and subscribe to our channel. This simple action helps keep our structure standing, allowing us to continue producing high-value documentaries for those who love the Bible. And take the opportunity to let us know in the comments. From what part of the world are you watching this story? We will read and respond to each one of you with great care. Now get ready, because what Elijah is going to propose at the top of Mount Carmel leaves no room for retreat. Elijah does not convene an assembly to debate theology or present a new religious reform project. He understands that the minds of those people were so numbed by the spiritual mixture that words alone had lost the power to alter national reality. What he brings with him is not an emotional appeal, but a mechanical and direct confrontation. He decides to take Israel's crisis to the only place where Jezebel's diplomacy couldn't protect it, the top of Mount Carmel. Imagine the scenario from the perspective of a documentary filmmaker of the time. On one side, you have the complete apparatus of the state. King Ahab arrives with his royal escort, surrounded by the luxury that syncretism provided the court. Right behind him march 450 prophets of Baal, men dressed in the finest priestly garments that public money could buy, exuding the confidence of those who have the full support of the government machine. They were the experts, the darlings of the system, the owners of the official truth. On the other side, the map of history places a solitary man. Elijah has no army, has no assistance, and carries no symbol of earthly power. He stands alone before a crowd that looks at him with a mix of curiosity and contempt. But Elijah does not retreat. He makes a cold read of the situation and realizes the people are standing still in cowardly silence, waiting to see who the winner will be before picking a side. It is at this moment that he launches the ultimatum that would change the logic of Israel forever. How long will you waver between two opinions? Elijah's proposal is a brilliant example of an elimination strategy. He knows theory is useless now. He needs physical evidence. He proposes a trial by fire, literally. The rules are established surgically, so there is no margin left for backstage tricks or ambiguous interpretations. There would be two altars, two bulls. The prophets of Baal would choose one, Elijah would take the other. They would cut the animal into pieces and place them on the wood, but with an absolute restriction. No one could light a fire. The challenge was a logistical checkmate. Baal was revered as the Lord of Storms, the god who controlled lightning and fire from the sky. If Baal were who the priests claimed he was, lighting an altar in front of 450 voices in unison would be the simplest task in the world. Elijah was cornering the pagan deity in his own specialty. The prophet shifts the burden of proof entirely to the opposing side. He doesn't just want to win an argument. He wants to expose the functional incapacity of a lie. Elijah then gives preference to his opponents. He allows the 450 to begin the operation. This decision was not an act of courtesy, but a devastating psychological maneuver. By yielding his turn, Elijah forces the system of Baal to expose itself first. He allows the people to watch for hours the desperate human effort to try and manufacture a miracle. He wants the crowd to see, feel, and register the frustration of a belief that promises much but, at the moment of real crisis, remains silent. The people accept the challenge immediately. The logic was undeniable and fair. If a God is God, he needs to have the ability to intervene in matter, respond to his followers' call, and validate his own existence. Elijah ends the negotiation phase. From that moment on, the history of Israel would no longer be decided in palace corridors or by royal decrees, but on the ability of a deity to produce a visible result. It was 450 against 1, the greatest numerical disproportion ever seen in a public trial. Elijah knew that if nothing happened that day, he would be lynched right there. But he operated under a certainty that military logic could not map. The challenge was cast, the altar was ready, and the silence of Mount Carmel was about to be broken by the greatest spectacle of futility and subsequently of power that generation had ever witnessed. The game wasn't just changing, it was being rebooted under new rules, with only accepted currency was manifest truth. The first side begins its operation. In the morning light, the 450 prophets of Baal take the center stage. They prepare the bull, cut the animal, and place it meticulously on the wood. Everything is perfectly aligned according to their religion's liturgy. If you were there, just observing the aesthetics of the moment, you would be impressed. There was an imposing theatricality, an institutional weight. The physical effort and intensity of those men were undeniable. They began to cry out in unison, "O Baal, answer us!" The sound of 450 trained voices echoing across Mount Carmel must have been deafening. They danced, leaping around the altar they had built in a ritual of stubborn repetition. The hours begin to pass. Morning advances into noon. The sun reaches its peak, punishing the dry land of Israel, but the altar remains cold. Externally, everything seemed absolutely right. But in the real world, where truth needs to manifest in matter, nothing happens. and the silence of the sky begins to become those priests' worst enemy. It is exactly at noon that Elijah decides to intervene, but without rushing. He uses a devastating tactical weapon against his opponent's minds. Irony. He doesn't interrupt the ritual, he ridicules it publicly. Elijah mocks the mechanical failure of that belief. He tells the prophets to shout louder. He suggests that their God might be busy, meditating, traveling, or maybe taking a nap, and needed to be awakened. This provocation destroys whatever emotional control the priests were still trying to maintain. The public pressure crushes them. King Ahab is watching. The entire crowd is observing every move. The ritual then spirals into absolute despair. The liturgy rapidly escalates into barbarity. They begin to shout with even more fury and, following the extreme custom of their devotion, start cutting themselves with swords and spears. Blood begins to flow down their bodies, staining the priestly garments and the dust of Mount Carmel. Pay close attention to this psychological mechanic. When a false belief cannot produce results, it demands that its followers mutilate themselves to try and force a response that will never come. Effort turns into punishment. They try to buy their God's attention with their own suffering. The afternoon advances mercilessly. The bloody frenzy continues until nearly the time for the evening sacrifice. They had exhausted all their physical, emotional, and liturgical resources. They were exhausted, wounded, hoarse, and humiliated. But the historical record describes the outcome of this scene with surgical, devastating precision. There was no voice, there was no answer, there was no attention at all. The crushing silence proved Elijah's thesis before the prophet even lit anything. The people, watching that pitiful scene, began to awaken from their lethargy, because a monumental effort, full of intensity, screams, and blood, when it brings no response, has only one practical effect. It exposes the absolute emptiness of the lie. Falsehood can be noisy. It can have the support of the state. But at the end of the day, it is incapable of sparking a single flame in reality. Just as the people of Israel lived in confusion in Elijah's time, not understanding their own identity and lost among so many kings and false prophets, it's very common for you to also feel lost in the timeline when reading the Old Testament. Often, it's hard to know exactly where Elijah's story fits amidst the chaos of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. To solve this and end your confusion when reading, we've made available the e-book, The Bible in Chronological Order. It is a complete, illustrated visual guide that organizes absolutely all events, kings and prophets from Genesis to Revelation. By acquiring this material, besides unlocking your historical understanding, you help maintain our channel's structure, allowing us to continue producing high-value documentaries for those who love the Word. The link to get your ebook is pinned right now in the top comment. Now, back to the top of Carmel. The absolute silence of the false prophets cleared the stage for Elijah's final move. The grotesque spectacle of blood and screams finally ends. The prophets of Baal retreat, exhausted, hoarse, and defeated by the very silence of their belief. And then a heavy quiet takes over the top of Mount Carmel. The sun is already starting to dip towards late afternoon. It's Elijah's turn. If you were there watching this scene, the first thing you would notice is the clash of behavior. After hours of collective hysteria on the other side, Elijah does not show an ounce of haste. He does not run. He does not go into a trance. He does not scream. His movements are cold, calculated, and surgical. His first step carries an absurd historical weight. Elijah doesn't start building a new altar from scratch. He walks over to the ruins of the old altar of God, which had been broken and forgotten by the people, and decides to repair it. He chooses exactly 12 stones, representing the 12 original tribes of Israel. Understand the mechanics of this action? He wasn't just stacking rocks. Before a nation cracked by political division and the mixing of beliefs, Elijah was reminding those people of who they truly were. Before the fire could fall, the foundation needed to be restored. But it's what he does next that raises the tension level to an almost unbearable point. Elijah didn't just want to win the challenge. He wanted to destroy any possibility of future doubt. He begins to dig a wide trench around the altar. He arranges the wood, prepares the bull, and places it on the structure. And then he gives the most irrational order the crowd could hear. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the wood and on the sacrifice. Think about the weight of that command. The country was facing a severe drought of 3.5 years. The earth was cracked. Water at that moment was worth infinitely more than gold. Wasting 4 full jars on top of an altar in the middle of the desert seemed like an act of madness. But Elijah doesn't stop there. He demands, "Do it again," and then do it a 3rd time. 12 jars of water were poured. The volume was so absurd that the water soaked the meat, saturated the wood, ran down the stones, and overflowed, filling the trench he had dug. The entire altar became an island in the middle of mud. Why did he execute this logistical maneuver? Because Elijah was bulletproofing the operation. In ancient times, it was not uncommon for pagan priests to use illusion tricks, hiding hot coals under the earth to forge divine responses. By soaking the wood, Elijah creates a physical impossibility. He drops the chances of natural ignition or human fraud to absolute zero. If something caught fire there, the laws of physics would have to bend. The last drop of water trickles down, and silence once again dominates the mountain. On one side, 450 humiliated men. On the other, a solitary prophet before an altar impossible to light. Israel's indecision was seconds away from colliding head-on with reality. The stage was set, and the escape route for doubt had been locked. The sun began to descend on the horizon, painting the sky of Israel with the colors of the late afternoon. Historically, that was the exact moment the evening sacrifice was usually offered in the temple in Jerusalem. There was an intentional alignment on Elijah's clock. He was not operating on the time of despair, but on the time of the covenant. The crowd, which had spent the last 6 hours watching a grotesque spectacle of hysteria, mutilation, and failure by the 450 prophets of Baal, now held its breath. The contrast in the environment was glaring. The pagan priests were cast into the corners, bleeding, hoarse, and exhausted. On the other side, Elijah walked with firm and calm steps toward the island of mud and soaked stones that he himself had built. The moment had arrived. The mechanics of that instant demanded a resolution. Elijah stops in front of the altar. He does not raise his arms in a frantic trance. He does not start dancing around the wood. He does not raise his voice to compete with the wind on Mount Carmel, and he definitely doesn't grab a knife to cut his own body. True power doesn't need hysteria to manifest itself. The prayer that Elijah makes next is one of the most impressive pieces of military and spiritual literature of the ancient world. In the original language, it has just over 60 words. It takes less than 30 seconds to pronounce. An absurd and humiliating contrast against an entire day of useless screams from the opposing side. Elijah does not make a long speech. He makes a surgical petition. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Analyze the weight of that sentence. Elijah is not asking for a pyrotechnic show to massage his own ego. He doesn't ask for fire just to win a public bet. He evokes patriarchal history, recalling the founding of that nation which had lost its memory. He doesn't say God of Jacob, but God of Israel, using the covenant name to remind those divided people who they really were. The goal of the miracle was not destruction, it was rescue. Elijah asks that the physical evidence bring the nation's identity back home. He finishes the last syllable. There is no repetition. There is no prolonged effort. The response that the prophets of Baal sought for hours with blood and sweat and failed to get comes to Elijah in a fraction of a second. And then it happens. It was not a spark appearing in the middle of the wood. It wasn't an ordinary lightning bolt fallen from a passing cloud. The ancient text describes a catastrophic and immediate event. The fire of the Lord fell. A column of flames of indescribable thermal intensity plummeted from the sky like a targeted meteor. The response was direct, undeniable, and brutally visible. The physics of combustion dictate that water is the natural enemy of fire. Saturated wood should nullify any attempt at ignition. But the energy that struck that altar didn't obey the rules of nature. It dominated nature. The impact didn't just ignite the wood. It incinerated the material reality in a devastating way. The fire consumed the sacrifice in milliseconds. It devoured the soaked wood as if it were dry straw. But the detail that paralyzes any attempt at human explanation comes next. The fire didn't stop at organic matter. It calcined and turned the 12 stones of the altar to dust. It burns the earth itself, consuming the dust around the structure. And in a final act of absolute power, the thermal energy instantly vaporizes the 12 jars of water that filled the trench, leaving the ground completely dry, as if water had never touched that soil. What occurred on Mount Carmel was a total annihilation of doubt. Baal, the supposed god of storms and fire, was unmasked in his own specialty. Where the false god failed to light a dry twig all day, Elijah's God vaporized stone and water in the blink of an eye. The deafening flash and the heat wave left the crowd in shock. The illusion of syncretism was shattered into 1,000 pieces. What was once a comfortable doubt, sustained by Jezebel's politics, had now become a crushing certainty. That lethargic people who couldn't decide which side to take were forced to face the raw reality. The confusion ended. The indecision was over. The answer did not come through endless arguments or philosophical debates. It came down from the sky, burning into the retina of every man and woman present, the most overwhelming empirical evidence in history. There was nowhere left to run, nor any way to hide in the middle ground. The decisive moment had been fulfilled. Thick smoke still rose from the spot where, seconds before, there was an altar, 12 stones, and 12 jars of water. The heat, radiated by the impact of the divine fire, still hit the faces of the astonished crowd, and the reaction of that people, who spent years in a state of spiritual dormancy and cowardice, was absolutely instantaneous. No one needed a theological explanation. No scribe needed to open a scroll to interpret what had just happened. What was seen on the top of Mount Carmel was more than enough. The physical evidence ran over any argument, excuse, or political convenience. The historical text records that upon seeing the charred altar and the completely dry trench, the entire people fell on their faces. The crowd that was once paralyzed and silent, fleeing responsibility, now shouted in unison, "The Lord is God! Only the Lord is God!" The confusion finally ended. The lie machine sponsored by Queen Jezebel crumbled in the public square. The 450 prophets of Baal, who hours before flaunted confidence and the total support of the state, were now cornered, exposed as absolute frauds before the entire nation. Indecision ended in a millisecond of fire. But if you analyze this event with an investigative magnifying glass, you will notice a disturbing detail. The most important aspect of that day was not the fire itself. The fire was just the mechanism of the response. The most important thing was what that fire revealed about the human condition. It revealed that we, as human beings, have a terrible tendency to try and balance realities that are completely incompatible. We create divided altars in our own minds. We want the comfort of truth, but we don't want to give up the lies that bring us immediate advantages or social approval. Israel tried to do this for years, mixing the historical covenant of God with the financial and climatic convenience of Baal. They wanted the benefits of both things until the entire structure rotted from the inside. The story of Elijah and Mount Carmel is not just an ancient record about an impressive miracle in the Middle East. It is a brutal diagnosis of the need for decision. It's about the courage not to live divided. It's about understanding that you can't keep your feet in two boats going in opposite directions without ending up being torn in half. Because the undeniable truth of human history is that there always comes a time when you can no longer postpone the choice. The system will corner you. The crisis will knock on your door, and the lukewarm mixture you tried to sustain won't have enough strength to generate a single spark to save you. The middle ground is an illusion that only survives until the trial by fire. And that is exactly why this historical narrative puts us against the wall today, with the same intensity of that challenge in 850 BC. Now, I want to open a real debate here in the comments. Elijah single-handedly confronted a lie that was applauded and sponsored by the very system of his time. Looking at our reality today, do you think we have lost that courage? What is the biggest lie that current society normalizes and that the majority is afraid to confront? Write your most sincere opinion down below. The smoke at the top of Mount Carmel dissipated almost 3,000 years ago, but the echo of that day continues to ring with the same intensity. The story of Elijah against the prophets of Baal is not an ancient fairy tale about a divine pyrotechnic show. It is a brutal and timeless treatise on collective cowardice and individual courage. The nation of Israel was not healed just because it saw fire come down from the sky. It was forced to wake up because a single man refused to accept the lukewarm mixture that the state and society had normalized. To understand the gravity of this political and spiritual collapse that led an entire nation to sit on the fence, you need to understand the context of the time. The problem is that by reading the Bible in a fragmented way, you lose the historical weight of this narrative. Without understanding the timeline, it is difficult to comprehend who King Ahab was, what Queen Jezebel represented in the geopolitical scene, or how the kingdom of Israel divided until reaching this critical point of total corruption. And it is exactly to cure this confusion and unlock your understanding that we created the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. With this complete visual guide, you will be able to map every king, every prophet, and every empire, from Genesis to Revelation, organizing the history in your head in a linear and definitive way. By securing your copy today, besides drastically elevating your level of scripture reading, you help keep our team standing, allowing us to continue producing these high-value investigative documentaries. The official link to acquire your ebook is pinned right now in the first comment. Returning to our story, there is a final, painful, and absolutely necessary lesson. The middle ground is the most dangerous place a person can park their life. When you try to please two opposite realities to avoid friction, you do not become neutral. You become null. In 850 BC, the people's excuse for religious mixing was the fear of economic crisis and drought. Today, the excuses may have changed names, but the cowardice of the middle ground remains the same. Elijah proved in practice that truth does not need a parliamentary majority. It does not need government sponsorship, and it does not need popular acceptance to be absolute. It only needs someone with enough courage to restore the altar and not back down in the face of the majority's noise. Loneliness on the side of truth will always be infinitely safer than applause on the side of a lie. If this documentary opened your vision, leave your like, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next investigations, and share this video with someone who needs this message. The decision was never about the fire, it was always about the altar. Thank you very much for joining us this far. Until next time,